This week's module examines the crises of monarchical authority in the middle of the 18th century, which precipitated revolutionary ideas on the periphery of Western civilization, in the British colonies and in Russia, for example, and which eroded the strength of the most powerful example of absolutism in Europe, the French crown. The influence of the Enlightenment is evident in some of these cases, but we should not think of these crises as just examples of the power of the intellectual movement to instigate revolution, especially since revolution would not come to Europe until the end of the 18th century. Absolutism developed fully during the reign of Louis XIV in France. Despite the challenge of the Fronde, which echoed the issues of the English Civil War, Louis recovered and established a powerful regime based on his personal charisma and ability to keep enemies isolated. This situation allowed Louis to upset the internal balance of France. For example, he revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which ended toleration of Protestants in France. Protestants generally left France during this period, which made France even more Catholic in nature and allowed for absolutism to flourish due to the alliance between the crown and the church. Unchallenged, Louis instigated a series of wars that expanded the French frontiers, but also created a budget crisis. When Louis XIV died in 1715, his lengthy tenure as king meant that his grandson would take the throne. However, Louis XV was a child, so initially there was a regency directed by his uncle, the Duke of Orleans. Immediately, the Duke inherited a financial crisis based on the exorbitant costs incurred under the previous king. The Duke of Orleans invited an English economist, John Law, to serve as his financial advisor in order to repair the French economy. Law had two ideas, both drawn from his experiences in England. The first was the creation of a central royal bank, similar to the one established in England. The bank could lend the crown money at low interest. At this point, the king borrowed money from the nobility at an exorbitant rate. This would repair the credit of the kingdom and reduce the costs of large-scale enterprises such as wars or road building. The second idea was the establishment of joint stock companies to exploit the New World holdings of France in North America and Polynesia. These two companies, the Mississippi and South Seas companies, were to stimulate the economy through investment and importation of goods, particularly specie and cash crops. The company's stock immediately soared thanks to speculation and insider trading. Many of the original purchasers of the stocks were nobles who had the privilege of buying first. The price of these stocks spiraled upwards until 1720, when news that the presumed wealth of the New World possessions turned out to be far less expected reached France. This information was suppressed, but eventually the speculation on the stocks ended. The bubble burst, leaving stockholders holding worthless paper. The experiences under Law led to protests against the Regency, and in an attempt to avoid a similar situation to the Fronde, the Duke of Orleans sacked Law, who was subsequently chased from France. The failure of the stock companies led to rejection of all Law's policies, including the Royal Bank, which was having some success. And the turn to venality is a method of solving the economic crisis. Venality is the selling of noble titles by the crown. Venality had been used under Louis XIV as a method of both generating funds and controlling nobility. However, when Louis XV turned to it, it created new social problems for French society. France and the rest of European society at this point was a society of orders based upon birth. The three orders, the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, were not evenly divided. The clergy, which did contain a few commoners, was about 1% of the total population, the nobility about 4%, and the rest was the third estate, which contained a wide variety of people, peasants, merchants, artisans, indigents, etc. Wealth was not an indicator of status. Rather, a noble title was important. Movement between the different estates was almost non-existent. Venality offered a solution to the lack of cash flow for the French crown. Venality presented the opportunity for immediate cash, as the crown sold off offices at an increasing rate in the 1730s and 40s. However, the sale of offices created new fiscal problems for the French crown. The problem is that while these offices provided funds in the short term, the sale of them exacerbated long-term economic problems. Noble offices, for example, included gage, wages for services rendered to the crown. Often these services were minimal, but nevertheless, the increase in the number of nobles added new costs to the French state. Additionally, noble offices were ennobling for their holders, which meant that the purchase of an office guaranteed that the office would be passed on to descendants. Ennoblement also meant that purchasers became exempt from taxation, as nobles were in this period. Thus, wealthy members of the Third Estate, an important tax base, could escape taxation through ennoblement, in essence shrinking the overall tax base of the crown. Also, the increased sale of offices meant that their value declined, shrinking the amount coming into royal coffers. This meant that taxation was harder to collect and that revenues from venality decreased over the course of the 18th century. Thus, other taxes were implemented by the French crown, including a head tax, similar to an income tax, called the vingtième, which called for a 20th of wealth to be paid to the crown. These taxes were invoked during a series of wars in the 1750s, the Wars of Austrian Succession. Louis XV imposed this tax temporarily on all his subjects, including the nobility, but could not sustain it due to the conflict with the traditions of the nobility being tax exempt. Thus he turned to increased taxation on the poor, such as the gabelle, a tax on salt that disproportionately affected the poor due to their reliance on salt as a food preservative. The implementation of taxes on the nobles and the heavy taxation on the poor created social tensions and eroded Louis XV's popularity during the 1750s. Despite the continued emphasis on divine right as a cornerstone of absolutism, Louis XV caused controversy with his policies. Moreover, his personal life appeared to be outside the expectations of a leader appointed by God. His very public affairs with a series of mistresses and his use of public funds to purchase expensive gifts for these mistresses generated some criticism for his regime. These affairs, with Madame du Barry and with Madame Pompadour, led ministers and nobles to question the influence of women on the king's judgment. His infamous sexual escapades provided evidence of his lack of leadership and questioned his commitment to affairs of running the kingdom. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence of the declining popularity of the King of France is in the response to a series of laws passed in 1750. A revolt in Paris was set off due to local gendarmes enforcing a royal decree issued to reduce the number of indigents in the capital. Subjects found without a clear reason for being in public space were arrested and removed from the countryside. Police began to round up all kinds of people, including children who roamed the streets. The disappearance of children concerned Parisians, who protested against the law. Rumors quickly spread about the king's need for the blood of children to cure various diseases he had caught from his dalliances. The power of these rumors to motivate protests illustrates how far the king had fallen in terms of public opinion. The challenges that Louis XV faced suggest the weakening of the absolutist model, although other leaders in Europe continued to prosper. The influence of the Enlightenment on the nobility, who were upset at the increased taxation and encroachment on privilege, illustrates that revolutionary aspirations developed, but despite the continued protests against the French king, no revolution appeared in the 1750s. The ideas of rationality, reason, equality, and the free exchange of ideas were influential in the heart of Europe, but would not lead to the initial challenges against royal authority in Europe. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment contributed to a questioning of despotism and to question the consolidation of power, as well as presenting an emphasis on the need for social and political reform and to enact natural laws. However, the first revolt of the late 18th century came not in France or Prussia, but in Russia. In 1773, a peasant named Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, who had actually died, leaving Catherine the Great in charge of Russia. Pugachev convinced a group of peasants to follow him and help to restore him to his quote-unquote rightful place on the throne. The pretender also gained the support of the Cossacks in the southern area of Russia near the Volga. Leading an army against the Tsarina's forces, Pugachev's band took control of several cities in southern Russia. Pugachev's revolt was initially quite conservative in its origins and intent, as Pugachev sought to gain the power of the Tsar for himself, but not to reform Russia. However, by the end of 1773, Pugachev articulated more revolutionary ideas, such as the end of serfdom and the removal of Western influences, including the Enlightenment, in Russian society. This in turn led to a popular revolt against the nobles, even against those who supported the revolt, which caused disarray. Eventually, Catherine recovered, and her army soundly defeated Pugachev's forces in 1774. Nevertheless, the revolt illustrates the pressure for social change developing, even at the periphery of the Enlightenment. At the other end of the Enlightenment's reach was the reaction in the British colonies in North America. A series of wars fought between the British and the French led to increased costs for the British Crown to protect the colonies. The colonists rejected the attempts of George III to increase taxation to pay for the military presence. The frontier wars also meant that the military was larger in the colonies, which further expanded tensions. Invoking the ideas of the Enlightenment, colonists complained about their lack of representation in Parliament. The imposition of indirect taxes on goods and services also led to protests against the British government. Lastly, the colonists were concerned about the control that mercantilism gave the British Crown over the economic life and choices of the colonies. The conflict between some of the colonists and the British Crown led to a series of actions, including an attack on the companies working through the Boston Harbor in an attempt to change government policy on mercantilism. This attack, known as the Boston Tea Party, followed an earlier skirmish, the so-called Boston Massacre, in which British soldiers and colonists fired at each other during a protest against taxation. While militias attempted to intimidate British authorities, eventually a group of colonists decided to form a legislature, the Continental Congress, to decide how to deal with the issues of royal authority in the colonies. Congress decided for independence and declared war against the British, which brought the European powers into the conflict. Louis XVI, the more popular successor to Louis XV, decided to support the colonists with financial and military assistance. After the War of American Independence ended in 1781, France was the first to recognize the sovereignty of the United States in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The revolution in the colonies was instigated by the notions of natural rights, one of the central concerns of the Enlightenment. The decision to aid the colonies, however, set in motion a series of events that would lead to a revolution in France as well. Louis XVI's aid to the United States came during the continued economic challenges facing the Crown. Attempts by Louis to implement temporary taxes, as Louis XV had, failed, and the Crown was in desperate need to generate funds in order to avoid bankruptcy. These attempts were thwarted by a group of noble judges, known as Parlement in France, who found that the attempts to tax the nobility as unconstitutional. The actions of Parlement illustrate limits to absolutism that were becoming increasingly evident at the end of the 18th century. The numerous publications against the Queen included Les Belles, pornographic stories starring the Queen. Her imagined sex life became the center of debates concerning the royal family, and much like his predecessor, Louis XVI found his personal life at the heart of political debate. The reliance on the notions of divine right led directly to questions about the morality of leaders. The king's most important need was to solve the taxation crisis, and to do so, Louis had to change the laws to allow him to tax the nobility. The king gathered together a number of nobles who were loyal to him in an attempt to push through these changes. The Assembly of Notables, gathered in 1787, failed to give Louis the power to change this tradition, and told him that he would need to call on the Estates General in order to get what he needed. The resistance of the nobility would be the undoing of the king, and the calling of the Estates General, the first time since 1615, revealed the collapse of absolutism in practice, as the king could not dictate policy without the input of his subjects. When the Estates General was called, there was still no revolution in France, but the ideas of the Enlightenment and the need to reform were going to influence the representatives who would answer the king's call. By the end of the 18th century, the push for reform contributed to the inability of leaders to continue to practice absolutism. Subjects were seeking to be citizens, more involved in the political life of their states.